This is CGTN.
Of results rather coming in for the last quarter of the year as well. So let's start with the East African breweries. Half-year profits up by 33% to about $65.2 million. The short version is they're saying that, look, 2018 went pretty well because, in fact, we're recovering from the election slump that was there in 2017. We'll have a deep dive into those numbers and plenty more as they come through. Here's what's coming up tonight. MTN gets into fresh trouble with authorities in Uganda. Egypt's economy is forecast to grow by over 5% in this fiscal year. Global leaders advocate for equality at the World Economic Forum in Davos. But let's start tonight in East Africa, where the Ugandan president, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, says that the telecommunications firm MTN needs to sell shares of its local subsidiary on the local stock market in order to facilitate domestic ownership of the company. That being said, relations between MTN Uganda and the authorities have become rather strained of late, especially after the country deported two of its executives after accusations that they were compromising national security. Speaking on the sideline to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Mr. Museveni added that the telecommunications firms in Africa are often foreign-owned. He's right on that, but in his view, they repatriate profits back home to the detriment of local economies. According to the telecommunications giant CEO Rob Shuter, the firm is in talks with the state-controlled National Social Security Fund for a possible sale of shares to the fund. The Ugandan government has deported 3 foreign nationals who are working for the telecommunications company MTN. Police in Uganda saying that these senior officials were a threat, allegedly, to national security. Here's CGTN's Isabel Nakiria explaining how.
Ugandan police have declined to reveal further details of the charges against the 3 deported experts. MTN Uganda's chief marketing officer, Olivia Printrout, a French national, and the head of sales, Anita Bura, a Rwandan national, were taken out of the country after being briefly detained. They are accused of undermining state security. The general manager for MTN's mobile money, Elsa Mussolini, was also deported following allegations of inciting violence on social media. Police said the decision had been taken to disrupt suspicious activities.
We've been getting information that they were misusing their positions in the different offices to compromise security. Definitely in those offices they access information, they access technologies, and so we looked into the information that we were receiving.
MTN Uganda has confirmed the deportations and says the company is committed to operating within Uganda's legal framework. Rwanda has protested against the deportations of its nationals, saying it's a witch hunt. In a tweet, Rwanda's Foreign Affairs Minister accused Uganda of criminalizing Rwandans living and working in the country. This is not the first time that Ugandan forces have raided MTN offices over security concerns. Meanwhile, police sources say they are looking for more MTN employees suspected of inciting violence. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala.
Right then, so problems in Uganda, problems in Nigeria. Let's dig into the numbers with Chris Carter, joins us now live from Johannesburg with a view on MTN. So, Chris, the MTN shares were at least 4.4% lower at one point today. They've fallen by over 6% so far in January, and they're over 38% in the red in the last 12 months. What is it that investors at the JSE not like about MTN?
I think a lot of the valuation sits in countries like Nigeria, which have really targeted MTN. I actually use the MTN example as a reason why Nigeria is actually almost uninvestable, because it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. If you want to nurture an investment environment, you don't actually, target your investors to a point that you actually want to effectively wipe them out and remove the capital base. And I think that's the difficulty that MTN faces, is that you could say it's an iconic African South African company, but also an African company that actually stands with the giants of the world in telecommunications. But unfortunately, in each country, they do enjoy market leadership in many of the countries that they operate in. But it's difficult market conditions, and very often, because of the actual size of the business within those countries, it becomes a target. But it also means that I think that the company needs to pay attention in terms of bedding the company in to be seen and perceived and valued as a local operating company, even though it's actually owned more broadly. Right. From a foreign perspective, but one needs to actually still embed a local identity.
Right, so one of the key risks that was flagged by Moody's this week was the possibility of a long drawn-out fight with the Attorney General in Nigeria. There's still a dispute over there of a tax claim worth $2 billion. So, assuming MTN is found liable and they do want to remain in Nigeria, is this a bill they can afford to settle relatively fast?
No, not at all. Okay, the bill is way out of proportion. To the actual business there, the actual profits, the actual capital base, and it goes on top of an enormous fine that they slapped on MTN previously, and it really illustrates a rather acrimonious approach that the Nigerian authorities are taking towards effectively a foreign investor. To my mind, it's very counterproductive. Even if the authorities believe that they're right, and let's say even if they are right, it certainly illustrates that the actual reaction in terms of penalties, etc., are over the top, it really doesn't augur well. The problem with Nigeria is that there's been a number of companies from South Africa going there and then abandoning Nigeria and withdrawing themselves, even at great losses. Now, I can understand that with one. I can understand that with two. But when it becomes 8, 9, 10 companies and beyond, it actually is a reflection on the country itself that becomes uninvestable. And so it's not only MTN that's facing these uphill battles with the Nigerian authorities. Nigeria is an exceptionally difficult place to do business. It's a complex place to do business. There are easier jurisdictions around the world that you can actually choose from, and that's the reason why I think Nigeria languishes in the stakes. You can't get you make money, you can't repatriate those profits. There's electricity shortage. You've got to overinvest to keep your masts going in the case of MTN. Anyway, there's a number of companies that have gone there with big balance sheets, with big investments. They had the corporate muscle to capitalize the business there properly, and they haven't managed to succeed.
All right, let's put our technical analysis hats on. So both Nigeria and South Africa, they're both stuck in relatively slow growth ruts. But what is the market expecting from MTN's second half or fourth quarter numbers, if you will, especially on EBITDA and CapEx in both markets, given all the things that we've just discussed?
Well, fundamentally, the MTN business is a good business, and it's, I think, from the technological nexus that we're actually sitting in the fourth industrial revolution, your telecommunication companies are in fact in quite a strong position in that particular field. And so Nigeria MTN from an operating point of view should actually be quite good, but it's these large, you could say, contingent liabilities that are being created, such as a tax dispute with the Nigerian authorities, that is not constructive. It creates uncertainty. You can cope with the risk, but you can't cope with uncertainty as far as an investment is concerned. Now, MTN also struggles with sanctions being imposed on another of their big markets, and that's Iran. And so you've got some of the big markets that they are really struggling with in terms of the actual jurisdiction in which they are operating. But from an actual operating point of view, MTN is still it's actually an astonishingly good company from an operating point of view. It's just struggling with these what I call self-inflicted problems, not from MTN's point of view, but when you talk about the jurisdiction, the Nigerian government is imposing self-inflicted problems for investors as a whole in that country. It's not just MTN, and one would expect them to actually try and put in a more nurturing environment, especially in a low-growth context, that you'd want to attract capital to the country, but in actual fact it becomes extremely difficult.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Chris Hart in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you. Now, let's turn our attention to Egypt. The country's economy is expected to grow by 5.3% in the fiscal year ending in June. That at least is according to the forecast for economists polled by Reuters. Now, Egypt's non-oil private sector activity did shrink for the fourth month in a row in December. Private sector activity has expanded in only 5 months in the last 3 years. Now, hoping to bolster investor confidence, the North African economy has been implementing some relatively tough economic reforms as part of a 3-year, $12 billion deal agreed to with the IMF in November 2016. Those include introducing a value-added tax, cutting energy subsidies, and of course floating the Egyptian pound. All right, our company news wrap starts with telcos. Different one though. This is Vodacom. Its share price was down by over 7% on Thursday morning. That comes after trading update showing that the company's South African service revenue declined for the quarter ending 31st December. Group revenue was up 1.5% to $1.66 billion. Operations were down, and total service revenue was up 2.4% to $1.36 billion. In Kenya, a bitter dispute has erupted between regional authorities and the multinational Tata Chemicals over land rates. The investor had over millions of dollars in defaulted land rates, apparently. Tata Chemicals, formerly known as Magadi Soda, had said it's incapable of paying land rates on the 224,000 acres of land that they use to mine soda ash. The regional authorities are demanding some $168 million or so as accrued land rates since 2013. But the company says they can only afford to pay $326,000 a year. The Japanese retailer Uniqlo will become the main Olympic partner and official clothing partner for the Swedish Olympic and Paralympic teams. Under the arrangement, the Japanese retailer will provide its lifewear apparel to Sweden's athletes and officials for 4 years. That includes the Tokyo 2020 Olympics and Paralympics, the Beijing 2022 Winter Games, and associated competitions and activities. And a Ugandan company has started using blockchain to certify shipments of coffee to try and meet growing demand from consumers. Now, blockchain essentially works by providing a shared record of data held by a network of individual computers rather than a single party. Its supporters say this makes it much harder to tamper with, and therefore it's a good way, a secure way of tracking goods along the entire supply chain. That's a run through your company headlines. It's time for a short break. There's plenty more coming up, including this. Global leaders are advocating for equality at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We'll have the latest. And we'll look at what Kenyan CEOs and the Kenyan government want to do in order to fight corruption in the East African economy. All that and more is coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. Leaders from around the world are flocking to Davos this week for the World Economic Forum. However, there does appear to be a common desire to address the unequal concentration of wealth and power around the world. CGTN's Guy Henderson has more on this particular story from Davos.
She may not be quite the force she once was, but German Chancellor Angela Merkel still commands a crowd in Davos. The Chancellor's plea in defence of multilateralism struck a note here.
We are facing populist challenges. There are nationalist forces and we have to go up against them. And perhaps this will make the battle clearer and stronger. And so I, with the members of my government, will fight with all our strength that the multilateral order doesn't end with the European Union, but becomes a force that can find answers to the new challenges. But for this to happen, we of course cannot drive the existing orders so far into the ground that no one believes new options anymore.
That means reforms, they are still hard to come by. In the meantime, Europe can hold up its trade deal with Japan as proof it can act. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was another voice speaking out in defence of free trade.
Effective the 1st of February, which is just around the corner, the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement will enter into force. The entire world should benefit from the economies and efficiencies these two mega deals will bring about.
Not all European governments are so convinced. Italy's economy remains fragile. Its populist Prime Minister told delegates the road to recovery is taking back control.
Our experience might be an indication of what Europe is going to look like tomorrow. There is a key word around which we have been constructing our political vision and also our daily activity. Such a word is people.
With America sitting this year out entirely, such views remain in the minority here.
One thing both sides of the debate agree on is that since the 2008 financial crisis, too much money has remained in the hands of too few people. Where the differences come in is over what to do about it. With one side saying we should fix the system we've got, the other one saying it's time to rewrite the rulebook. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Davos.
In his address to the World Economic Forum, the South African head of state Cyril Ramaphosa said he's hoping for more capital inflows and more development opportunities for South Africa. Here's part of what he had to say.
We recognize that we cannot create work on any meaningful scale unless we grow the economy at a far greater pace. And for that, we need a number of things to be in place. But one of those key issues is that we need more investment, particularly in the productive sectors of our economy, as well as infrastructure. But we want to underpin that with a vigorous program of skills development, thereby developing the human capabilities of South Africans and make them ready to be able to engage, to work in the technologically changing world on an ongoing basis.
All right, then, so let's follow what's been happening over at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Guy Henderson has been following developments over there. He joins us now live from that Swiss ski resort town. Good to see you, Guy. So neither the heads of state from the US or in China are in Davos at the moment, at least not for this particular event. But how is this US-China trade war playing out amongst the delegates? Are they seeing any odds of a positive settlement?
I think there's a lot of worry about that here. Certainly has been a dominant part of the discussions, particularly on the day before this, when we heard from Huawei executives, from the Chinese chipmaker Huawei, Chinese technology giant Huawei, basically encouraging business leaders to speak out about the impact of this trade war between the United States and China before it gets out of hand, really, and starts, spiraling and affecting more sectors and costing the economy more and more money. We heard from the Vice President of China as well, putting forward the case that the US and China were far better off cooperating than clashing over these trade issues. Mike Pompeo also had his say during the discussions, where he effectively said, yes, sure, we're happy to welcome a Chinese delegation to Washington. We're happy to move towards perhaps some kind of trade deal with China, but Mr. Pompeo and and the Trump administration are under a lot of pressure from both sides of the political divide in the United States at the moment, not to fold too quickly. And so I think one of the discussions taking place here at the moment is about the prospect of an economic slowdown, but that, also a worry about a sort of worst case scenario, if you like, where on the 1st of March, a deadline expires, and then you have 25% tariffs on $200 billion more Chinese goods. And then just a few years later, towards the end of March, you have the potential for a hard Brexit. And that very quickly potentially turns the kind of discussions here about an economic slowdown into a sort of starker discussion, perhaps about a global recession.
Indeed. Speaking of Brexit, though, the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, was also around, and he did speak quite a bit about Brexit. One of the things that stood out for me was when he said most UK businesses are entirely unprepared for a no-deal Brexit. Assuming that does happen on the 29th of March, the UK crashes out, is there anything in its toolkit that the BOE can use to at least smooth things over?
I mean, definitely dangerous to assume anything at the moment in terms of Brexit. I don't think really anyone has any idea what could happen over the course of the next few weeks. But what Mark Carney did make clear is that the Bank of England would be assuming the worst case scenario. So he said they were, preparing, under the assumption that there would be a hard Brexit at the end of March, and that they would, then be able to take action to try and protect the economy. He effectively warned against making too many assumptions about what the bank might do in terms of whether to put the interest rates up or down in the event of a hard Brexit. It is a sort of very unpredictable environment to tell exactly what would be needed, on the 29th of March, or if there was a hard Brexit in the event that there was an extension and then a hard Brexit, a long way in the future. But yeah, the other thing he was saying during his address and sort of question and answer session was that, Britain was logistically underprepared, drastically underprepared for a hard Brexit, to be able to manage a very quick, literally overnight transition from frictionless trade into a trade which involved a border and managing that trade coming in and out of the country.
Indeed. One last question for you, Guy. Machine intelligence, or artificial intelligence, as so many are referring to it as. What's the general view in Davos on this? Are there any delegates attending this who think that the risks or the benefits from machine intelligence are just being overblown at this point?
I think, that definitely has been part of the discussion when it comes to AI. There's that kind of mystery which a lot of experts have been trying to work out, which is that particularly developed economies have access to all of these new technologies, to artificial intelligence, and yet there is still this challenge or this sort of question as to why productivity levels in those countries often aren't increasing rapidly, despite the fact that they have access to all that technology. We've spoken to a number of AI experts over the last few days, and there are sort of varying reasons given for why that might be. Perhaps the measurements are wrong is one argument. Another one is that perhaps businesses just haven't quite got their heads around exactly how they can benefit, and so either aren't making use of it at all, or if they are using it, they're not using it in quite the right way. But what these same experts do say, or the most optimistic ones at least, is that 2019 they do see as a sort of breakthrough year where, yes, you might have had the most tech-savvy tech companies making use of this kind of technology and benefiting from it, but that now it was getting to the stage where perhaps more traditional businesses that perhaps wouldn't necessarily see things like AI as being something they could benefit from, increasingly coming to understand it and increasingly starting to bring it into their businesses and boost efficiency and potentially boost the growth of the business.
Indeed, and of course that ties back into the conversation on inequality, but we'll leave it there for the time being. Guy Henderson there live in Davos. Now, let's focus on Tanzania. It's been ranked 119th out of 139 by Forbes magazine in its annual rankings of the best countries to do business in. The East African nation has recently been making some improvements in the fight against corruption. With the details, here's CGTN's Daniel Kijo.
At Alaska, Tanzania, business is booming. In just 6 years, the company has grown from a small startup to one of the country's leader in processing and distribution of food products. The founder says the company's dedication to improving products is key to their business success.
But you look at the imported products, it's not because we cannot produce locally, but because we cannot add value to meet the standards of the international products that come in.
Despite the success of people like Jennifer, Tanzania remains on the low end of the Forbes latest report on the best countries for business. The report highlighted the heavy tax burden, red tape, and changes to investor protections as reason for its low ranking.
Despite these challenges, recent policy changes by President Magufuli's government are aimed at protecting domestic industry by creating a better business environment. And it comes at a critical time as Tanzania continues its drive to becoming a mid-sized economy by 2025.
The government held a meeting with the private sector in 2017 to discuss the challenges of doing business in the country. The result? The Blueprint, a document outlining tax and policy reforms geared towards a single goal: making business easier. The Tanzania Private Sector Foundation is responsible for sharing the interests of the private sector with the government. They say continued dialogue is key for Tanzania to improve its business ranking.
Consultation mechanisms. I feel like the government and the private sector need to sit down and determine what the business environment should look like. It is both for the benefit of the local private sector, but for foreign investors as well.
The relationship between the government and private sector has not always been easy, but many trade experts believe that business people like Jennifer Bash are the building blocks to the country's future. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
Let's take it to a country that many of you probably haven't really heard of, the tiny landlocked Southern African country of Lesotho. It's pushing ahead with a number of economic reforms to grow local industries and cut unemployment. The country is home to just over 2.2 million people. The unemployment rate there is 27%. Now, Lesotho struggled with political wrangling and leadership changes for decades, but it's calmed down in more recent times under new government. The latest changes there, including a new raft of economic policies that include a ban on certain food imports. CGTN's Sumitra Naidu has that story.
Lesotho is surrounded by the majestic Maluti Mountains inside of South Africa, where almost all of its produce comes from. But the Small Business Ministry is now spearheading policy to limit imports and grow local industries.
We import about 500 million worth of chicken, frozen chicken, from Brazil through the channel of South Africa. So we say, no, that really is disadvantageous to our economy. It cannot grow. That's why since this government came into power and I became the minister, I went to the cabinet and asked, no, let's try to engage our own people into doing things. if we can really embark on agricultural products, start making end products with them, we can really shake the economy.
The agricultural sector has been identified as a source of job creation. Unemployment in Lesotho is at 27.25%. Most people work in clothing factories. The government believes developing local agriculture will also help to drive down high food costs.
Lesotho are very good at rearing chicken, but in a small scale. But you'll find that in many households, they have chickens, but they don't have the slaughtering facilities. That's why they cannot get into the big supermarkets because of the standards. That's why we said, no, now the government has to build these abattoirs in order to make it easy for the farmers to take their products to the big shops like ShopRite.
Lesotho has already banned the import of eggs and A-grade red meat from South Africa, and it's commissioned the construction of new chicken and pig abattoirs. The government has invested $10 million to grow the chicken industry alone.
We are building 2 abattoirs, pig and chicken abattoirs, at the same time. And that is in process, so the Ministry of Defense for building for the government is ready to start construction of that. Then we are going to create a lot of jobs, because even the GDP, even the wage bill of the government cannot absorb any more employment.
The abattoir will have the capacity to slaughter around 30,000 chickens a day. It will also give rise to a string of downstream industries.
Grow soya beans, grow sunflower, and create animal feed. You understand? It's going to create a lot of jobs. So that process, we are working on it by organizing. And I'm also the Minister of Cooperatives. So we are organizing the cooperators to be ready to plant certain crops.
It's been a tough call for the people of Lesotho. While thousands engage in subsistence farming, it's not enough. The country depends heavily on imports from South Africa, but the government is determined and believes the move to ban certain imports will help develop farmers to increase production and give rise to new business and industry. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Lesotho.
Now, the government in Zimbabwe is working to boost tourism and investment in the country in general. It's partnered to that end with Touch Road International. It's a Chinese multinational group to form Tour Africa. Now, this project doesn't just seek to market the Southern African nation, but also it apparently wants to establish deeper cultural ties with the East.
Zimbabwe continues its drive to boost investor interest in the country with the hope to help turn around its economy. The country has partnered with Touch Road International to form the Tour Africa project, which plans to attract tourists from China across 3 countries in Africa. The project seeks to not only market Zimbabwe as a destination of choice, but also to establish cultural ties with the East and promote cultural exchange programs.
The launch of Tour Africa comes at a time when we, as government and as a ministry in particular, we are engaging the world to come and invest in Zimbabwe. We know our president's mantra, Zimbabwe is open for business. Zimbabwe is open for tourism. Zimbabwe is the best, peaceful, safe tourist destination on the continent and in the world.
Through the project, Zimbabwe is set to receive 350 Chinese tourists every month as from March 2018. The tourists will travel through Djibouti, Tanzania, and finally arrive in Zimbabwe.
We can arouse the interest of both sides in each other. We can open a window for each other. That first, we maintain the confidence. Second, we promote the understanding. And third, we will take action. Then we can achieve prosperity and development.
Meanwhile, the president and manager of Touch Road International Holdings Group, Zimbabwe's own Tendai Mtawawira, and Penelope Jane Dunlop, also known as PJ Powers or Tandeka, have been appointed patriotic tourism ambassadors to help promote Zimbabwe as a destination of choice. Terry Wangare, CGTN.
It's time for another break on the program. Plenty more coming up, including this. We'll have the latest on the ongoing saga around Carlos Ghosn, the embattled former chair of Renault-Nissan. And Ethiopia's national carrier sets up a $65 million five-star hotel.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Welcome back. Let's run through the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in the DRC, where Felix Tshisekedi has been sworn in as the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is the first peaceful transfer of power in that country's history. He took the oath of office in front of a large crowd. Tshisekedi takes the helm from Joseph Kabila, who's ruled the country for the last 18 years. In his remark, Tshisekedi pledged to release all political prisoners in the country. He also appealed for peace and for tolerance. Zimbabwe's army has said soldiers accused of beating residents in townships following protests over fuel price hikes were imposters, it says, who tarnished the name of the military. Security forces there have been cracking down on violent demonstrations that erupted last week after President Emerson Mnangagwa decreed a sharp increase in the price of fuel by at least 140% overnight. Rights groups say that a dozen people have died in the unrest. Police, though, are putting the figure at 3. Over Nigeria, one of the main candidates in next month's Nigerian presidential election has stepped down. Obi Ezekwesili, who's also well known for leading the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, that of course refers to the 200+ girls kidnapped in Chibok. She says she wants to form a broader coalition to defeat the two main parties. In a statement, she said she was committed to building a coalition that would offer Nigerians a viable alternative to the two major parties, that's a governing All Progressives Congress, or APC, and the main opposition, People's Democratic Party, PDP. And finally, Venezuela's opposition is seeking to maintain pressure on Nicolas Maduro after Congress chief Juan Guaido declared himself as interim head of state. Now, the Congress chief has won backing from a range of countries, the United States, Canada, several right-wing Latin American governments among them. Maduro, however, has severed diplomatic ties with the US and now he's ordered its diplomats to leave the country within 72 hours. Washington says, though, it will not comply. Massive demonstrations have taken place across the country, both for and against Nicolas Maduro. That's a run through your headlines. All right, then let's jump into the world of cars. The French car giant Renault has announced a new chairman and a new chief executive to replace Carlos Ghosn, who previously held both positions. Michelin's Jean-Dominique Senard has been appointed as chair, while Thierry Bolloré will become chief executive. Now, Ghosn has been in jail in Japan since the middle of November. He's accused of financial misconduct at Nissan. He had remained at the helm of Renault. He had held both top jobs at both car makers because of an alliance between them and a smaller partner, Mitsubishi. The chairman will be responsible for managing Renault's alliance with the Japanese car maker Nissan. The CEO will be coordinating the car maker's day-to-day activities. All right, then, quite a bit to get through on this particular story. Let's get more on this story from CGTN's Oliver Miocic. So, did Mr. Ghosn resign of his own volition as Renault CEO, or did the French government act here because it does own 15% of the car maker after all?
Well, towards the end of what has been a 2-month saga for Renault, there really was quite a lot of pressure from the French government, especially from Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire. Last week, he had called on Renault to have this extraordinary meeting and for a change in leadership. And that tone was remarkably different from what happened in November when Carlos Ghosn was arrested in Japan. Then the French government and the car maker Renault called on the Japanese government for more information and said that they believed in the presumption of innocence. But as time has gone on, I think that the French government has found it in a very difficult position. Now, it does own 15% of the car maker, so it does have a very big voice in what can happen with the company. And sources close to the company say the French government, over the past 2 months, had already been teeing up people as a replacement to Carlos Ghosn.
Right, so from the perspective of the French government, can this Renault-Nissan alliance remain intact, in place, without Ghosn leading it? Is there any business sense, really, in keeping the current arrangement?
Well, in terms of business sense, it is quite difficult for you to continue going along as it is with your CEO and chairman behind bars awaiting trial. Remember, he has been denied bail by the Japanese authorities, and so it has become a little bit of a sticking issue for the French government, and so they believe that the best course of action was this clean break.
All right, and a clean break indeed. But at what point will both sides sit down and decide to address what seems to be the main issue here, an imbalance in the company's capital structure? Renault has a 43% stake in Nissan with voting rights, but Nissan only has a 15% stake in the French car maker and no voting rights. What solutions are being considered for that?
So Nissan, over the past 6 months, has said it would be willing to buy out the French stake. Now, that's something that the French are uneasy about. And then the French, in the terms of the government and Renault, also want to have this controlling factor over the relationship. It was Renault which put in Carlos Ghosn when they bought that big stake in 1999 from Nissan, saving it from an almost near certain bankruptcy. And now the French government, within the last 4 days, has gone back to Tokyo and said, we would like this partnership to continue, but we would like to name the new chairman for Nissan. We are going to put in a new person in charge of Renault. So it is a very testy relationship, especially over the past 2 months. Well, the Nissan CEO has actually been speaking today. Hiromoto has been saying that it is not the time now to be speaking about how they will readdress the balance, but he is happy that Mr. Senard has been made the chairman. He's somebody that he believes that he can have an open conversation with, and that once the communication gets better and the trust is rebuilt between the two companies, they will then be able to have those type of talks.
All right, one last question for you. So last November, car sales in Europe are down by over 8%, as I understand it. So how's this Franco-Japanese alliance fared as car sales are dropping, emission standards are tightening, particularly in the wake of Dieselgate?
Well, it has been a very difficult year for both retailers. So if we start with Renault, their full year sales figures came out earlier this week, and it showed that for the Renault car brand itself, those sales were down by about 5.2% for the full year to 2018. Now, Nissan's results haven't been released for the full year, so we can only go on their half-year figures, but even they globally were down by about 1.2%. And it really is across a lot of markets. The only markets where both companies are really accelerating is in China and in Canada. Across the board, sales are down in Europe. That emissions scandal really has rocked the boat, not only with those two car makers, but with several others, including Volkswagen, where the scandal first emerged. So it is a very difficult landscape, but I was speaking to representatives from both car makers at the Paris Car Show a few months ago, and they said the future really is in the electric production of vehicles. And so if you look at the Nissan Leaf, which in certain markets such as Norway, where there is a government subsidy to buy that more expensive car, which is powered by electricity, sales are doing quite well. It's in mainland Europe where there needs to be some government subsidies, is what the executives from Nissan and from Renault are saying. They need these government subsidies to try and get the sales up, because at the moment the cost to produce the batteries is far too great, and they really need the sales volume in order to bring the cost down and then for more sales to pick off.
Indeed. So the latest chapter there in L'Affaire Ghosn. Thank you very much for that, Oliver. He's live there in Paris. Now, let's move on to another end of the world. Venezuela now. At least 4 people have died there in clashes as thousands of anti-government demonstrators take to streets across the country. There's growing anger and frustration over soaring inflation, unemployment and the shortage of basic goods. And people there want new elections, complicating matters even further. And opposition leaders declared himself as interim president, and that is a move that's been recognized by the United States. CGTN's Stephen Gibbs is in Caracas.
Well, this is one of the main opposition gathering points here in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. And I should say the opposition is also meeting at many cities across this entire country. Now, the opposition says, unlike previous attempts when they've tried to put pressure on the Maduro government through meetings like this, they say this is different for two key reasons. One, they say that for the first time, the poorest people of Venezuela, those people that the socialist government here says it's defending, are coming down from the barrios, as they say, those poor communities around Caracas, and they are joining the opposition. The other big change is that the opposition is making a direct appeal to the Venezuelan military to join them, to abandon Maduro and to join them. They say they are the vast majority. Now the government says all this is organised, it says, by foreign forces. It says it still has the support of the people, and in an attempt to demonstrate that, it is organising its own pro-government march as we speak. But from what we can tell, the big numbers are here with the opposition. One other key change that's been happening in the last couple of weeks is in terms of international support for the opposition movement in Venezuela. We have heard unprecedented comments, mainly from the United States, also from the regional neighbours here in Latin America, declaring that they see Maduro as an illegitimate president, and they are giving their support to the elected National Assembly, the parliament here, as it moves forward. Now, will this make a change? Really, those two key factors are what are going to decide this. Whether this opposition movement, which has traditionally been middle class in Venezuela, whether it can persuade the working class people of this country, the poorest people, to join them. Then we would get the huge numbers that would put real pressure on President Maduro. And the other key thing is whether the military has the guns, the military has the power. It is traditionally the arbiter of power in this country. Will it shift? Will it decide that it has had enough of President Maduro? The early signs are really that the leadership of the Maduro government, the leadership of the army, is with President Maduro. Maybe the junior ranks are having their doubts. They are themselves experiencing the economic problems of this country. But for the time being, it does appear that the military is backing the government of President Maduro. But we will see. This could be just the beginning. The opposition here certainly saying this sort of gathering is a turning point. Stephen Gibbs, CGTN, Caracas.
Now, Africa's biggest and at this point most profitable carrier, Ethiopian Airlines, plans to open a $65 million skylight five-star hotel in the country's capital, Addis Ababa. The construction of the building started in 2016. Once finished, it's expected to be the largest single hotel in the country. CGTN's Girum Chala has more from Addis Ababa.
Motivated by the 10 million passengers it carries per year and the over-booming growth of its business, Ethiopian Airlines has invested hundreds of millions of dollars and is completing the constructions of this hotel and this expansion of Bole International Airport. The hotel, dubbed Ethiopian Skylight Hotel, will be the largest in the country. On its first phase, it will have 373 bedrooms, 4 restaurants, among other world-class facilities. The 40,000 square meter Ethiopian Airlines 5-star luxury hotel is expected to take advantage of the almost 70% transit passengers of the airliner passing through Addis Ababa.
70% of our traffic today is transit, which is really challenging traffic because in terms of competition, that is more intensive than competition on traffic to and from Ethiopia. So this hotel is going to help us to transform that 70% transit traffic to an inbound traffic to Ethiopia.
Continuing its support to the rapid growing Ethiopian economy is another aim of this soon-to-be inaugurated hotel. ET wants to use it to attract more tourists to the country while providing a service that complements with the private sector.
We're not trying to compete with the private hoteliers. We're only adding or complementing the hotel shortage that prevails in Ethiopia today. And I'm sure you witness yourself during the African Union annual conference, the hotel shortage is very critical, and it's a national issue. So that's one part, one logic for the hotel. The second one, as I told you, is we are building an in-house tour operation within the group. We call it ET Holidays. So ET Holidays is promoting tourism and leisure market for the airline and for the country. So hotel is an integral part of that package.
The $65 million Ethiopian Airlines hotel will have the largest and well-equipped Chinese restaurant in Africa. And the hotel will also be managed by the China-based Grand Skylight Hotel Management Company.
We are going to have the largest and the best Chinese restaurant in Africa here in this hotel. And it's going to be managed by a Chinese hotel management company. So we are very strong in China as an airline. We're going to promote packages. So we are envisioning quite significant number of Chinese visiting Ethiopia using this hotel. So that is the ultimate aim of the hotel.
Ethiopian Airlines will also commission this tremendously expanded terminal at Bole International Airport. With almost 3 times the capacity of the existing airport, Ethiopian Airlines Group said the newly expanded facility will have 86 check-in counters and 10 luggage drop points. Now, with this state-of-the-art $363 million terminal at hand, Ethiopian Airlines aims to serve 22 million passengers annually, more than double of its current capacity. With the largest MRO service, the largest aviation academy, the largest catering and cargo service in the continent, Ethiopian Airlines Group continues to profitably lead the aviation business in Africa. The Ethiopian flag carrier is confident and is eyeing to conquer the global aviation sector sooner. Group Data CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Right, then quick on to commodity prices here for you. So we're seeing a bit of an uptick in crude oil prices in relation to the events that we're seeing in Venezuela. Futures in New York, that's essentially WTI crude, up by over 1% in the last hour or so. So here's the thing. Venezuela oil output is actually lower than what Nigeria puts into the market. It was about 1.3 million barrels per day by the end of December last year. The question, though, is if the US continues with this strategy of pressure, perhaps imposes sanctions on the country, that's going to reduce output and essentially generally add to that reduction in supply that we've been seeing for the last couple of weeks. Now then, let me take you to South Africa, where a pair of entrepreneurs there have launched a range of dolls as part of an effort to encourage children to embrace their own beauty and their natural hair. The Sibale collection has also grown to include an albino doll. Is that story on Grassroots tonight?
A South African startup has created a new range of African dolls hoping to empower African girls and capitalize on growing demand for the toys on the continent. The Sibale collection, which means we are beautiful in Zulu, was created in 2016 to help build confidence in African children by gifting them dolls that they can relate to. They also sport fashionable outfits that are designed and stitched at a workshop in Pretoria.
We felt if we created a doll that would be representative of an African child, for the child to grow up knowing that I'm beautiful, I'm pretty, to associate prettiness and beauty with themselves rather than looking outside for external validation factors to who they are.
The dolls are made in Germany and are later assembled and dressed in South Africa before being packaged for sale. Sibale dolls are sold at an outlet in Johannesburg and are also available to online buyers. The dolls sell for a minimum of $31 US. The company also manufactures clothes for the dolls and merchandise, which includes boots, umbrellas, and bags for children.
I also like it because we be the same.
When I bought her the doll, she was like, look, mommy, she looks like me. So now she's not trying to be what she's not. And she's able to identify with this doll. And for her, she says the skin color, her hair is like her, you know, and she also likes the fact that they smell like chocolate. So I think that's a bonus.
The dolls also come with other aromas like vanilla and are made in a variety of skin tones and hair textures.
The dolls, we made sure the texture of the hair is as realistic to Afro hair as possible. And so the experience that they have is similar to taking care of their own hair. Whether